Following a disaster, you may find water-damaged textiles bleeding dyes onto other objects, or perhaps the ink on wet paper staining the surrounding pages of a book.
Dyes that you might encounter in textiles or paper are usually not harmful to people, but they will stain your hands, they can stain your clothing, so you might want to wear clothing you're not so concerned about.
Along with protective clothing, you'll also wear gloves, eye protection, and a lab coat or apron. You'll want to get wet textiles and wet paper dry or stabilized as quickly as possible. To prevent dye transfer problems from getting worse, avoid moving any objects that show signs of bleeding until you have stabilized the situation.
If you already have a dye that's dissolving in the water and starting to move around, what you want to do is try to blot the water away first. It's probably best not to try to move something that you think is in the process of transferring dye. So the best thing would be to leave the object in place and try to blot the water as best you can.
Start by removing excess water. For this, you'll need blotting materials, probably lots of them.
And you want them to be light colored so that you can see if there's dye transfer. So light colored sheets or towels, pillowcases. If you have blotting paper, that's the best.
If you need to move textiles or paper, careful handling is a must. Remember, wet fabrics and paper will be heavier and as a result more fragile than usual. Use boxes, trays, or platforms for support, or a canvas stretcher if there's one available. Initially, you may need to keep wet fabrics or paper separate from each other by using clean white towels, sheets, or other blotting materials. After removing the excess moisture, move on to drying. Air drying offers an effective way to stabilize wet paper or textiles if you can get to the objects quickly before mold sets in. But there is one requirement.
You're going to need a lot of space because you need to lay everything out as much as you can for it to dry. You need to separate, say, a mat from a print so that the air can actually get to the object so that it can dry it out.
A lot of space means a well-ventilated room indoors or outside in the shade, never out in the sun. Use fans, air conditioners, and open windows to circulate air in a room, but not directly onto the objects. With bleeding paper-based objects, you'll need to interleave by inserting clean, absorbent blotting materials between pages to soak up moisture. Take care not to rub or blot materials that have soluble inks. You could do more harm than good. You'll also need to work delicately to separate pages from each other and stop the transfer of ink or dye. Interleaving requires lots of materials, patience, and time. Wet textiles have some specific drying needs.
When drying textiles, you want to press the water out with flat hands, preferably with the object laid out as flat as it can be. Sometimes people use clean sponges to press water out with so that you're not putting uneven pressure on the surface of the textile. The last thing you want to do is wring or twist the object because you will both potentially cause dye transfer all over the place, but you'll also distort the shape of the object and damage the fibers.
While you're drying, check for any iron or other metal fasteners that can stain the fabric when wet. You can guard against staining by inserting cut-up clear plastic bags or some other protective material between the fabric and the metal piece. Here are some other suggestions for drying wet textiles. If you can, try blocking and shaping each object back to its original form. Avoid stacking wet textiles on top of each other. In the long run, if you're not sure what to do, get help.
If you run into situations that are out of the ordinary where things are stuck together or you don't really understand the construction of the object, it's best to leave it and get some advice. Talk to a conservator or to a curator in that specialist area.
If you're unable to get to wet items quickly, freezing is a safe option. Or if you have many objects, it may be your only option.
The reason why we freeze things after emergencies is just to hold them for a little while until we can actually get to them. If you have too many objects for you to handle at a specific time, you can freeze them, and that will prevent the damage that occurs when they dry out from occurring until you can get to them. And it'll also prevent mold growth, which is one of the biggest problems with wet emergencies.
To prepare paper for freezing, You'll still interleave, but this time you'll use a cook standby between the pages.
You would want to interleave them with wax paper or something that would prevent the transfer of dye from sheet to sheet. If you're going to put them in the freezer, wax paper is the preferred interleaving material.
Textiles are prepared the same way. Separate them with freezer or waxed paper and pack them flat.
You can freeze it in a regular home residential freezer. You can also freeze it in a commercial freezer. And there are also trucks that you can call in that will come where the whole truck is a freezer truck, and you can freeze your entire collection if you need to.
The most important thing to do is act quickly, but carefully. Your goal is to try to stop the transfer of color or ink, first by blotting. Then you'll decide which of the drying options is best under the circumstances. In any case, consult the water section of this DVD, the field guide, or the salvage wheel for more information on air drying and freezing. And don't hesitate to call on a conservator if you have questions.